So picture this room. Like, really try to visualize the absolute surreal nature of this specific gathering.
Right.
At the center, you have the very first United States-born pope in the history of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, which is already a huge deal.
Exactly. And sitting right next to him, to his right, is this 33-year-old, openly atheist tech billionaire. A guy who co-founded one of the most powerful artificial intelligence labs on the planet.
It's just such a wild image.
It really is. And then, sitting just a few seats away from them, is a prominent theologian from the global south, and the entire room is just echoing with the clicks of international press cameras.
Because they're all there to discuss this massive document, right?
Yeah, a 235-page document about the future of human consciousness, artificial intelligence, and global power. I mean, it sounds like the setup to a very complex, maybe slightly dystopian joke.
Totally.
But this was a real event, a genuine threshold moment that literally just took place at the Vatican.
It is an incredibly striking visual because you have centuries of entrenched religious and geopolitical tradition just crashing headfirst into the absolute frontier of Silicon Valley innovation.
Yeah.
And then squeezed into the margins of that massive power dynamic, you have the voices of the developing world trying to cut through the noise of both of them.
Which brings us to what we're doing today, because for this deep dive, we are going to look at a fascinating, highly critical, and deeply analytical response to that exact room, and to the document that brought them all together.
We are unpacking an op-ed written by Christian Ortiz, who goes by Zach Echo.
Great.
He's a decolonial social scientist and the developer of a functioning piece of software called Justice AI GPT.
And his focus in this op-ed is on Magnifica Humanitas. That's the 42,300-word encyclical that was recently released by Pope Leo XIV.
Yeah, and Ortiz's essay is essentially this massive structural critique, not just of what the Pope wrote, but of who the Pope is sharing a stage with, and the historical shadow hanging over that entire conversation.
But before we wade into these waters, we really need to set a firm boundary for you, the listener.
Absolutely.
Because the source material we are examining today is dense, and it ventures into highly charged political, historical, and religious territory.
Ortiz is tackling systemic racism, historical colonialism, the institutional legacy of the Catholic Church, and the unchecked power of big tech. It's a lot.
It is a lot. So to be absolutely clear, our goal today is not to endorse Ortiz's viewpoints. We aren't here to validate the Pope's theology or, to defend the business practices of these tech companies.
As we're definitely not taking sides here.
Not at all. Our mission is just to impartially map out the arguments and the profound tensions presented in Ortiz's text. We want you to understand the mechanics of this debate.
Right.
Because regardless of where you fall on the political or religious spectrum, the way these massive global entities negotiate the future of artificial intelligence, well, it's going to impact your digital and physical reality.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the mechanism being deployed by the Vatican. I mean, when we talk about an encyclical, we aren't talking about a simple press release.
Yeah, right.
We aren't even talking about a Sunday sermon. This is the highest level of teaching directive within the Catholic Church.
Which is huge.
Right. It uses the Vatican's global moral authority to shape not just the beliefs of its 1.4 billion members, but global politics, legal frameworks, international behavior. It's designed to speak in moral universals. When a pope writes an encyclical, they are attempting to actually move the needle on human history.
And Ortiz argues that you cannot possibly understand the impact of this new document about the future of technology without understanding the documents this exact same institution wrote half a millennium ago.
Yeah, the historical context is everything for him.
Ortiz writes a line that honestly stopped me in my tracks. He says, "The church wrote the code that wrote the bias."
Wow.
Yeah. He points out that context isn't just a footnote to the AI debate. It is the entire architectural blueprint.
So he anchors his entire critique in a series of 15th century directives. He points specifically to a papal bull from the year 1452 called Dum Diversas,
Okay.
issued by Pope Nicholas V, and another one 3 years later called Romanus Pontifex. And these weren't just theological suggestions.
What were they exactly?
These documents explicitly authorize Portuguese sovereigns to invade, conquer, fight, and subjugate Saracens, pagans, and other infidels, and to literally reduce their persons to perpetual slavery.
Okay, let me stop you there, because the mechanics of this are crucial. How did a religious letter from a pope actually function as international law? Because we think of religion and state as totally separate today.
Right, yeah.
How did Dum Diversas actually dictate global wealth?
Well, you have to look at the geopolitical structure of the 1400s.
Okay.
The Pope was essentially the supreme arbiter of European international relations. So when the Pope issued a bull like Romanus Pontifex, it operated as a globally recognized property title.
Oh, wow. A property title.
Exactly. It gave the Portuguese, and later the Spanish, a legal monopoly on trade, colonization, and enslavement in newly discovered lands. Other European monarchs respected this because the alternative was excommunication and war.
So it was the ultimate leverage.
Yes, and this formed the legal foundation for what became known as the doctrine of discovery. It was the absolute permission slip for global colonialism. It literally wrote the legal architecture that justified the extraction of wealth from Africa and the Americas to build the modern European economy.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy, because this is where Ortiz's critique of the tech industry really begins to crystallize for me.
Yeah, go for it.
Think of those 15th century papal bulls as the original source code, or like the legacy operating system of the modern world.
I like that.
Right. They programmed the geopolitical boundaries, the economic extraction models, and the racial hierarchies that ran globally for centuries. If the bulls are the OS, then the colonial trade companies were the APIs, building wealth on top of that code.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
And now, skip forward 500 years. The exact same institution, the original developers of that legacy code, is releasing a 235-page software update, Magnifica Humanitas. And they're warning us that there is a terrifying new virus in the system. They are warning the world that artificial intelligence might become a tool of colonial dominion.
Is a staggering historical irony.
It really is.
Ortiz actually quotes scholar Anthea Butler to drive this point home, noting that the Catholic Church has never been an innocent bystander in the history of white supremacy or global extraction. They provided the moral and legal architecture that made it possible.
But wait, let me push back on Ortiz's premise for a second. Is it entirely fair to judge a modern pope who seems genuinely trying to address the dangers of AI by the actions of a guy who held the office in 1452?
That's a fair question.
Doesn't dragging up 500-year-old documents just muddy the waters of what is actually a very urgent modern technological crisis?
So Ortiz actually anticipates that exact pushback. He doesn't bring up this contradiction to simply dismiss the Pope's modern efforts. He isn't saying, you started colonialism, so you are disqualified from talking about AI.
Okay.
His argument is that the wealth, the power structures, and the global disparities created by that 15th century legacy code never reset. They compounded.
Ah, I see.
The Global South is currently vulnerable to tech exploitation, specifically because of the impoverishment structured by those early papal bulls.
Yeah.
Therefore, this is a threshold moment.
Right.
The institution that encoded racial empire logic into the global operating system is finally naming that same logic in algorithmic systems. Ortiz argues our job isn't to politely applaud them for finally seeing the problem.
Well,
Our job is to demand material accountability.
so it's not a dismissal, it's a demand for reparations based on a newly admitted guilt. He's essentially saying, you wrote the original bug into the software. Now that you've identified that the bug has mutated into artificial intelligence, what are you materially going to do to fix it? And this leads us to the sections of the Pope's encyclical that Ortiz actually praises. Because for all his skepticism of the Vatican as an institution, Ortiz is floored by the specific language Pope Leo XIV uses regarding modern technology.
Yeah, Ortiz states up front that he isn't interested in performing ideological purity. He wants to deal with reality. And the reality is that Pope Leo XIV states plainly in front of the entire world that technology is never neutral.
Which is huge.
The Pope writes that technology takes on the characteristics of those who devise, finance, regulate, and use it.
And that completely shatters the Silicon Valley marketing myth. I mean, tech companies have spent a decade convincing us that algorithms are just objective math.
Just clean code, right?
Yeah. If the algorithm didn't give you a loan, or if facial recognition misidentified you, they claim it's just an unfortunate statistical anomaly. But the Pope is saying, no, the algorithm is a mirror. It reflects the biases, the blind spots, and the profit motives of the people paying for the server farms.
And that formulation aligns flawlessly with Ortiz's own life's work. Ortiz created a theoretical and operational model called the DIA framework, the Decolonial Intelligence Algorithmic Framework.
Okay, tell me about that.
The central thesis of the DIA framework is that AI bias is not a glitch. It is the intended mathematical outcome of who is sitting in the room, who controls the computational resources, and whose epistemology is treated as the default reality.
Let's hover on that word for a second. Epistemology. It's a heavy philosophical term. How does it actually apply to something like training a large language model?
So epistemology is basically the study of knowledge, what counts as true and how we know it. In the context of AI, think about how models like ChatGPT or Claude are built.
Right.
They are trained on massive data sets scraped from the internet. Reddit, Wikipedia, digital libraries, news sites. The vast majority of this digitized, easily scrapable data is produced by Western industrialized English-speaking societies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Therefore, the model's epistemology, its fundamental understanding of how the world works, what is valuable, what is polite, what is logical, is entirely Western. It assumes individualism over communalism. It assumes extraction over preservation. If an AI is only fed data from a highly industrialized perspective, it will naturally view the rest of the world through that same extractive lens.
And the Pope arrives at this exact same structural conclusion just using Catholic social teaching instead of data science vocabulary.
Exactly.
And then he takes it a step further because the Pope explicitly frames AI as a new iteration of colonialism, calling AI data the new rare earths of power.
He warns that technology concentrated in the hands of a few profit-oriented groups represents a new form of colonial dominion. And this is not subtle language. The encyclical calls for restoring to individuals not just the data that describes them, but the structural ability to decide how that data is used, by whom and for whose benefit.
Which is the core tenet of data sovereignty.
Yes, exactly. Indigenous data scholars and researchers from the Global South have spent decades attending these international conferences, trying to get the concept of data sovereignty legitimized in policy spaces.
Just trying to be heard.
They have been fighting to establish that a community's data is an extension of their physical autonomy. And suddenly, here it is, enshrined in 42,300 words, addressed to every Catholic on the planet and every global policymaker looking for a moral framework to regulate big tech.
The leverage that provides to these marginalized researchers is immense. But, the encyclical doesn't stop at abstract concepts of data ownership. It gets shockingly granular about the physical human cost of AI.
It really does.
It dives into the reality of digital sweatshops. The Pope writes about the silent work of millions who sustain AI. We are talking about data labeling, model training, and content moderation. And Ortiz highlights that the Pope specifically names the regions bearing this burden: women in Kenya, the Congo, Ghana, and the Philippines.
This is such a critical point regarding the mechanics of AI that most consumers never see. When we interact with an AI, we think we are interacting with pure machine intelligence. In reality, we are interacting with a system heavily subsidized by invisible human trauma.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So there's a process called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, which is what makes AI chatbots safe and helpful. Before a model is released, it generates vast amounts of horrific, violent, and abusive text based on the dark corners of the internet it scraped.
And someone has to read all of it.
Someone has to read it, categorize it, and tell the AI, do not produce this. Tech companies outsource this psychological hazard to workers in places like Kenya or the Philippines, paying them incredibly low wages, sometimes less than $2 an hour, to spend their days consuming the worst elements of human psychology.
That is just wow.
These workers are the human foundation of the digital world. They act as a traumatic filter so that Western users get a clean, sanitized product.
And the Pope describes these dynamics, along with the child miners extracting cobalt and rare earth minerals for our physical devices, as forms of modern slavery.
Yes.
He calls out the hidden exploitation chains where health data is extracted from vulnerable populations under the guise of humanitarian aid, creating what he terms data colonialism.
It forces the invisible supply chain of digital convenience right into the light. Ortiz notes that when he has talked about women in Kenya and the Philippines as the actual human foundation of AI, critics have dismissed him as a radical activist. But now it is the official, documented position of the Vatican.
Let me push you on the real-world implications of this, though. When the Pope officially labels this invisible tech labor as a form of modern slavery, how is that supposed to change the behavior of the end user?
Right.
Like, if you're a listener right now and you use an AI assistant to summarize a PDF or write a line of code, does the Vatican's megaphone actually change anything about that interaction? Or is it just inducing guilt without providing a solution?
Well, it completely shatters the illusion of the magic box. For the average user, AI feels entirely frictionless. You type a prompt, and intelligence instantaneously appears on your screen. What this encyclical does is map the moral supply chain of that intelligence.
The moral supply chain, I like that.
Think about it like this. If you buy a cheap t-shirt, Decades of labor activism have conditioned you to at least wonder about the factory conditions where it was made.
Sure.
The Vatican is attempting to force that same moral awakening onto digital outputs. They are demanding that you recognize your cleanly formatted email draft is subsidized by the psychological trauma of a content moderator in Nairobi and the physical danger of a child in a cobalt mine. It doesn't necessarily tell you to delete the app, but it demands you stop treating the technology as an objective, victimless miracle.
It forces a massive cognitive shift. But here is where the story of this document takes a really dramatic turn.
Yeah, the launch event.
Yes, we have to pivot from the text of the encyclical to the actual launch event at the Vatican, because this is where the optics completely collide with the message, creating a profound rupture in institutional memory.
Pope Leo XIV didn't just release this document quietly. He used the launch event to issue a historic, unprecedented apology.
Which is wild.
Past popes have apologized for the sins of individual Christians or for the Church's peripheral involvement in historical atrocities, but Leo did something fundamentally different. He apologized for the role the Holy See itself played in legitimizing slavery. He acknowledged on a global stage that the Vatican gave European sovereigns the explicit legal authority to subjugate people, calling it a wound in Christian memory.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Let's look at the institutional incentives. The Catholic Church is dealing with massive global PR crises, declining attendance in the West, and a need to project moral authority in a totally secular age.
Yep.
Isn't this apology just an incredibly strategic piece of reputation management? Like, why should we view this as a genuine historical rupture rather than just a smart media play?
You aren't the only one asking that question, and Ortiz analyzes that exact skepticism. But he points to the reaction of Black Catholic scholars who state they have waited generations to hear the Vatican speak honestly about the Church's leading structural role in chattel slavery and enduring anti-Black racism.
So the impact is real regardless of intent.
Exactly. Whether the motive is partly PR or not, the function of the apology is a rupture. Once the highest authority admits institutional culpability for the legal framework of slavery, they can no longer hide behind the defense of being men of their time. They have admitted the system was corrupt from the root. Ortiz embraces this rupture because ruptures are exactly where decolonial work can enter and leverage change.
Okay, I see the weight of the admission. But then, and this is where it gets crazy, we look at the room where this historic apology is taking place. The optics of the launch event are just mind-bending.
Oh, absolutely.
The Pope has just presented a document condemning the concentration of AI power in the hands of a few private, profit-driven actors. He has just linked historical colonialism to modern digital extraction. And who is sitting in the seat of honor right next to him? Chris Olah.
The 33-year-old co-founder of Anthropic, the company that makes the Claude AI model.
The optics are staggering. Anthropic is an American AI company that has aggressively branded itself as the safety-oriented, highly ethical alternative in the AI race. But at this very event, sitting alongside cardinals and the Pope, Olah makes a stunning admission.
Yeah, he states that AI development operates inside a set of incentives and constraints that can sometimes conflict with doing the right thing, specifically citing commercial concerns.
This is a vital moment of corporate honesty that Ortiz heavily critiques. Olah is admitting on a Vatican stage that the hypercapitalist market punishes ethical behavior in the frontier AI space.
And furthermore, Olah admitted there is currently no functional mechanism to distribute the financial gains of AI beyond the wealthy nations and corporations that are building it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material provides a massive piece of context regarding Anthropic's ethical constraints, and it has real-world geopolitical consequences.
The Pentagon contract.
Yes, the Pentagon actually blacklisted Anthropic and chose to contract with OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, instead. And why did the military walk away? Because Anthropic insisted on putting parameters in place to guide how the Department of Defense could use its AI technology in warfare. Anthropic tried to enforce safety limits on the military, and the military simply gave the massive contract to a competitor who wouldn't ask as many questions.
And that detail perfectly illustrates Olah's point. If an AI company tries to be highly ethical and restricts military use, they lose billions of dollars in government contracts to rivals who are more compliant. The incentive structure of the market actively discourages morality.
So let's picture the room again. The man building one of the most powerful AI systems in human history is sitting next to the Pope, essentially throwing his hands up. He's saying, we operate in a system that punishes ethics, and we have absolutely no idea how to stop this technology from just making rich countries richer.
And what happens?
The room applauds him.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly what Ortiz finds so enraging. Ortiz points out that this is the Vatican's oldest institutional habit playing out in real time.
Right.
They are performing their historical playbook, naming a harm, while maintaining intimate proximity to the power that produces that harm. The Pope is treating a tech billionaire as a moral partner, even as that billionaire admits his company's commercial incentives conflict with the very human dignity the Pope is writing about.
And it's not like the Global South wasn't in the room to point this out. You have theologian Leokedi Lushombo, who spoke at the exact same event. She stated unequivocally that AI is likely to further violate the rights of the Global South and widen the gap between the rich and the poor. She is naming the impending violence of the system, while the architect of that system is treated as a VIP guest.
Ortiz argues that an apology and an encyclical do not automatically break the Church's 500-year pattern of sanctifying extractive power. The event itself was a performance of concern, not a worksite for justice. What breaks the pattern is material accountability.
Which brings us to the operational core of Ortiz's essay. He writes, "An apology without redistribution is a press release."
That is a devastating line.
It really is. He is demanding structural change, and he lays out 4 very specific material demands for Pope Leo XIV. Let's dig into the mechanics of these demands. Demand number 1 is regarding those 15th century documents. Ortiz demands that the Pope formally rescind the papal bulls Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex.
So this is about international law. In 2023, the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. They essentially said, these documents did not reflect the true teachings of the gospel, and we distance ourselves from how they were used.
Okay.
But Ortiz points out that they never formally rescinded, abrogated, or legally voided the actual bulls themselves. They left the original legal documents intact on the books.
See, I need to understand the practical difference here. If no one is using a 1452 papal bull in a modern court of law, why does it matter if it's repudiated versus rescinded? Isn't this just arguing over Latin semantics?
It matters deeply in the framework of decolonial legal theory. Repudiation is an emotional or theological distancing. Rescinding is a legal mechanism. Ortiz argues that the doctrine of discovery is the legal ancestor of every algorithm that treats Global South data as a resource to be extracted without consent.
Ah, the ancestor code.
Exactly. If you leave the foundational legal precedent intact, you are allowing the root of the tree to survive while complaining about the bitter fruit. If the Pope genuinely believes digital colonialism is a continuation of historical colonialism, he has to legally dissolve the foundation of the original act.
Okay, you have to actually delete the legacy code, not just apologize for it.
Right.
Demand number 2 moves from legal semantics to hard economics. Ortiz demands a comprehensive reparations framework. And he is very specific, not a solidarity fund, not a charitable development program, but reparations.
This is direct challenge to how massive institutions handled historical guilt. The Vatican holds unimaginable wealth. Art, land, institutional capital, global real estate, much of which is inextricably linked to the centuries of colonial extraction and slave labor that those papal bulls legalized.
Yeah.
Ortiz argues that apologizing without materially redistributing what was stolen is just storytelling.
I struggle to see the mechanics of this, though. How do you possibly quantify 500 years of global extraction? How does the Vatican write a check for the transatlantic slave trade?
Well, Ortiz focuses the mechanics of the reparations, specifically on the modern digital labor we discussed earlier. Through his DIA framework, he utilizes what he calls an economic equity protocol.
Okay.
He points out that the market rate for workers in the Global South has been deliberately suppressed for centuries. The reason a content moderator in Nairobi only makes $2 a day isn't just a quirk of modern supply and demand. It is the result of structured, historical impoverishment built on the exact colonialism the Pope just apologized for.
The compounding effect.
Yes. The historical extraction created the conditions for the modern digital extraction. Ortiz is drawing a straight, undeniable line from the 1352 papal bulls to the wage suppression of AI data labelers today.
So the reparations wouldn't necessarily be a blanket check for the past. It would be a structural intervention into the present economic abuse. He's saying the Vatican should use its immense capital to subsidize, unionize, or directly compensate the workers currently being exploited by the tech industry they are critiquing.
Exactly. It requires a material financial response that alters the current power dynamic, not just a pastoral letter expressing sadness about poverty.
That flows directly into demand number 3, a global AI ethics council. The Pope says we need a more moral AI, and that morality cannot be determined by a few powerful executives. Ortiz agrees, but points out the blatant hypocrisy of the encyclical's launch event. The people launching the document were a few powerful men: cardinals, a Silicon Valley billionaire, a Western theologian.
Ortiz zeroes in on who was excluded. Where were the indigenous data sovereignty leaders? Where were the African AI governance scholars? Most importantly, where were the women from Kenya and the Philippines who are actually doing the data labeling that the document explicitly calls modern slavery?
Ortiz's argument here is incredibly sharp. He is saying, if the people doing the invisible labor are named in your document as victims, but they aren't given a seat at the table where the future of the technology is being decided, then your table is still a colonial artifact. It's paternalism disguised as advocacy.
It is a devastating critique of corporate AI ethics boards as well. Every responsible AI framework produced by Google, Microsoft, Meta, or Amazon is usually authored by a small, highly paid group of Western executives and academics.
Behind closed doors.
Ortiz demands that the Vatican convene a governing body for AI ethics that is majority Global South, majority women, and majority people from extracted communities. And crucially, it cannot just be an advisory board that writes white papers. It must have binding authority over how the church deploys, endorses, and invests in AI.
Wait, let me push back on the binding authority aspect. How does a Vatican Ethics Council force Anthropic or OpenAI to do anything? These are sovereign tech corporations. They don't answer to the Pope.
They don't answer to the Pope theologically, but they answer to capital.
Oh, the investment portfolios.
Yeah. Yes. The Catholic Church and its affiliated institutions control billions of dollars in investment portfolios, hospital networks, and educational systems globally. If a global South-led ethics council dictates that Catholic universities and health networks will categorically boycott or divest from AI companies that utilize suppressed labor in Kenya, that is a massive market force.
That makes total sense.
Ortiz is demanding the church use its financial leverage as a weapon for justice, rather than just using its moral voice as a suggestion.
That makes the fourth demand incredibly potent. Stop platforming uncompliant companies. Ortiz demands that the Pope stop treating AI executives as moral partners until they demonstrate structural compliance with the encyclical's demands.
This circles back to Chris Ola's admission about commercial incentives. When Ola admits his company's incentives conflict with doing the right thing, Ortiz views that not as a badge of refreshing transparency, but as a confession of institutional corruption.
Yeah, I mean, if a company essentially says, hey, we want to be good, but our fiduciary duty to our shareholders forces us to do harm sometimes, you shouldn't give them a front row seat at a Vatican summit on human dignity.
Exactly.
Ortiz says that by blessing Anthropic's presence without demanding material change, the Church is doing exactly what it did with colonial monarchs in the 15th century, sanctifying extractive power and calling it a partnership.
It is a harsh, uncompromising mirror held up to the institution. But this is the pivot point in Ortiz's work. This is where the deep dive transitions from a critique of the Vatican into a look at what Ortiz is actually building.
Right, because he's not just complaining.
No, Ortiz isn't just an essayist throwing stones from the academic sidelines. He is a developer. He is answering the fundamental question. If big tech and the Vatican are doing this wrong, what does doing it right actually look like in code?
And this is the most vital part of the story. Ortiz contextualizes his software by pointing back 135 years to another pope, Leo III, who wrote a famous encyclical called Rerum Novarum.
That document was written during the heat of the Industrial Revolution to address the brutal exploitation of factory workers and new forms of urban poverty. The Church realized it couldn't stay silent on the new things transforming society.
And Ortiz maps that historical moment perfectly onto today. The new things today aren't steam engines, textile mills, and child labor in coal mines. They are algorithms trained on stolen data, autonomous weapon systems, and content moderators paid poverty wages to protect the mental health of wealthy Western users.
Exactly.
The Pope is absolutely right to name all of this, but Ortiz argues that naming the harm is insufficient. A diagnosis is not a cure. You need an operational system to counteract it.
Enter Justice AI GPT and the DIA framework, the Colonial Intelligence Algorithmic Framework. Ortiz is so emphatic about this. It is not a white paper. It is not a philosophy manifesto. It is a functioning operational piece of software.
So where the Pope offers a moral principle saying technology is never neutral, the DIA framework provides a mathematical methodology. It actively audits an AI's neutrality claims.
Right. It analyzes who benefits from a specific algorithmic output and designs accountability directly into the system architecture. Where the Pope warns about digital colonialism appropriating data, the DIA framework gives marginalized users the structural tools to flag and block that extraction in real time.
Wait, I am stuck on the technical mechanics of this. As a developer, how is Ortiz actually coding decolonialism into a large language model? Is he altering the weights of the neural network? Is he filtering the training data? Like, how does software perform decolonial theory?
It is a multi-layered architectural intervention. First, it involves radical curation of the training data. Instead of relying on the default Western-dominated scrape of the internet, Justice AI GPT weights its training data heavily toward Global South scholars, indigenous oral histories, and non-Western economic models.
Okay, so a totally different base of knowledge.
Exactly. Secondly, it utilizes the economic equity protocol we discussed. This isn't just a theory. It functions like a smart contract. If the AI generates an output that relies heavily on a specific indigenous dataset or Global South research, the system architecture is designed to trigger microtransactions or profit-sharing mechanisms that rep capital back to the originators of that data.
So it's fundamentally rewriting the economic supply chain of the prompt output.
Precisely. And thirdly, it addresses what the source text calls epistemological erasure.
Let's talk about that term.
The text argues that the people subjected to AI systems today are the exact same communities that were subjected to colonial governance centuries ago. It is the exact same asymmetrical power dynamic.
Let's really explore epistemological erasure because that sounds like an incredibly insidious problem. In the 15th century, Western colonial powers decided whose land could be legally seized and whose bodies could be owned. But they also decided whose knowledge counted as real knowledge. Indigenous cosmologies, African oral histories, local environmental knowledge. These were all dismissed as primitive, unscientific, or mythological by Western empiricism.
And that exact same dynamic is playing out mathematically inside data centers right now.
Wow.
The engineers building massive AI models decide whose data is valuable enough to scrape. But more dangerously, they build the mathematical vector spaces of the AI to simply reject non-Western ways of seeing the world.
Oh, so.
If an AI is only trained to understand the world through individualistic hyper-capitalist data, it will completely erase communal indigenous perspectives. The AI literally cannot compute a reality where land is sacred rather than a resource to be extracted, because that concept has no mathematical weight in its training.
So the AI becomes a tool that reinforces the idea that the Western way of thinking is the only valid objective reality. It standardizes human thought.
Exactly.
Ortiz built Justice AI GPT to be a structural interruption to that erasure. It is designed to refuse to reproduce colonial language.
Ortiz isn't waiting for the U.S. Senate to regulate big tech, and he isn't waiting for the Vatican to have another conference to decide the ethics of the future. He built the alternative inside the machine.
Yeah.
As Leo Katie Lushumbo pointed out at the launch event, default AI is widening the gap between the rich and the poor, following the brutal patterns of economic globalization. Justice AI GPT is coded specifically to do the inverse of that. It is a technological and philosophical rebellion.
So what does this all mean when we pull back and look at the whole picture? Ortiz quotes the Pope asking a profound question in the encyclical. Where are we going? Toward what goal do we wish to orient ourselves?
And most people, the Pope says, are just watching and waiting, hoping that tech billionaires eventually figure it out and do the right thing.
But Ortiz fires back at that assumption with tremendous pride and defiance. He says the global majority has not been watching and waiting. They have been surviving, they have been refusing extraction, and they have been actively building decolonial intelligence into the very systems designed to erase them.
The overarching metaphor Ortiz uses to close his argument is a door.
I love this part.
He acknowledges that Magnifica Humanitas is a massive achievement in one sense. The institution that wrote the legal code for 500 years of global extraction finally looked at the new digital extraction engine and said, we recognize this, we've seen this before, it is colonialism.
Right, that is huge.
That is a huge, heavy door swinging open on the global stage. But Ortiz makes it clear that recognizing the frame of the door isn't enough. You have to walk through it.
Yeah.
You have to endure the friction of building the architecture on the other side. Justice AI GPT is proof that a decolonial AI system isn't just an academic theory, it is running right now. Ortiz ends his piece by telling the world and the Vatican to either walk through the door and join the work or stay outside and continue debating the frame. He knows exactly what he is doing, and he is already building the future.
If we bring this all the way back to you, the listener, this deep dive profoundly reframes your daily interaction with the digital world. Whether you are using an AI assistant to prep for a meeting, write code, or draft an email, you are not just interacting with a neutral, objective tool.
Not at all.
You are looking at the culmination of invisible global labor. You are interacting with the echoes of historical legal frameworks. You are participating in a system of massive, centralized wealth concentration.
It forces you to look at that blinking cursor in a completely different light. It's not just a blank page waiting for your prompt. It is a convergence point of centuries of history, marginalized labor, and asymmetrical power.
And that brings me back to the thought we started with. We talked about those 15th century papal bulls functioning as the operating system for the modern world.
Right, the legacy code.
They were just a few legal documents written in Vatican Latin that most people never saw, but they dictated physical borders, global economies, and human rights for 500 years. So here's the question I want to leave you with. To mull over the next time you open an app, marvel at an AI image, or click I agree on a terms of service update. What digital frameworks, what user agreements, or what invisible algorithmic biases are we silently accepting right now that will dictate the shape of human reality for the next 500 years?